Welcome to FlavorSum's webinar about exploring how to sprout success with plant-based dairy. My name is Lisa Jackson. I manage marketing, insights, and communications here at FlavorSum. Thanks for joining the conversation today. We'll spend a few minutes exploring the market dynamics around plant-based, and then we'll share some proprietary consumer insights about dairy alternatives. I am recording the webinar, and I'll send you a link to the recording by the end of the week. If you do have some questions during the discussion, please submit them through the Q&A feature on Zoom. So with that as our housekeeping, let's go ahead and get started. I can advance it, there we go. Our topics today, as I mentioned, include an examination of market dynamics across plant-based dairy categories. Then we're going to dive right into the results from our survey of North American consumers, where we discovered what consumers like and don't like about plant-based frozen desserts, which will help us identify opportunities for new product development. Before we get started though, if you don't mind, let's ground where you are in the plant-based dairy market. This will help me adjust the content as we go. I'm going to launch a poll here in a moment. So tell me, are you just developing your plant-based strategy? Are you a recent entry into plant-based dairy? Are you having some early success, maybe 1 to 2 years experience? Are you in that more than 2 but less than 5, or are you firmly established? So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. If you don't mind, take a moment and answer that question for me. Okay. So it looks like from our results that most of you are at the early stages of entering the plant-based market. We do have a couple folks that have been in plant-based dairy for a few years, which is great. I'll go ahead and adjust the content as we go. So thank you for taking time to answer that. Okay, let me go ahead and end that. I'll go ahead and share the results so you can see, right? So many people are at the early part of the stage, but you do have people all along the way. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the market. I want to start by talking about plant-based milks, because what happens in the milk market definitely affects other plant-based dairy categories, not only from the producer's perspective, but also from consumer awareness and knowledge. The global plant-based milk market in 2019 was about $13 billion. It's maybe $15 billion in 2020. That represents only about 2% of total milk sales globally. But forecasted growth of dairy milk alternatives is really aggressive. It's 3 times what's anticipated for traditional dairy. Estimates vary across source, but most agree growth potential is high, between that 10 and 14% compounded annually through 2024. Growth reflects consumers' inability or unwillingness to consume data, either personal preferences, dietary restrictions, lactose intolerance, or allergies. And the prevalence of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and stroke is also encouraging consumers to shift to healthier diets, and plant-based dairy represents a solution. Most of the world relies on soy milks in the non-dairy space, reflecting both availability and preference in Asian countries. Almond milk holds a solid second place, with the other bases making up the balance. Now, the perspective in North America is very different. Here you can see that in both the US and Canada, almond milk holds a solid leading position. Now, in the US, oat milk edged soy milk out and claimed the number 2 spot after almond. And in the US, plant-based milks represent about 20% of total milk sales compared to 2% versus the global. So that's roughly $2.8 billion of a $10 billion market, and indicates it's a lasting acceptance among consumers in the US. Now, Canadian interest in oat milk is growing also. You see that 244% increase year on year, but the share is still lagging soy and coconut milk in Canada. Sales growth in milk alternatives in Canada, which reached about $340 million last year, that's 14% of a $2.4 billion category, reflect a growing distaste of the hormones, lactose, and saturated fat contents of conventional dairy, in addition to mounting environmental concerns. And those environmental concerns can't be ignored. People are becoming much more environmentally conscious, and sustainability is an issue. When we look at how consumers view plant-based milks, they have those that they put on the left side, the less sustainable, and those on the right. And this does affect then their perception of other plant-based dairy categories, including frozen desserts and creamers and yogurts. So on the left side, we have almond milk, which is dinged for being less sustainable because of high water usage, also the erosion of the bee population. Coconut water is viewed negatively because of deforestation and worker exploitation in some countries. Cow's milk gets negative reviews for high land use and carbon dioxide emissions. And rice milk is also on the left side of the equation because, like almond milk, high water usage is a negative. It's also viewed to be the least nutritional base among all the options, and it has some environmental concerns as well. Now on the right side, the more sustainable options include some niche bases. Up at the top, you have hazelnut and hemp. Both are grown in small batches, and so there's less of an environmental impact, and both are deemed to have good nutritional value. So if you're just starting out, these may be based to explore alone or in combination with something that is maybe more accessible. Oat is really the shining star on this side of the equation, predominantly because there's no deforestation, there's less water usage. But there is a cautionary tale here because if your supplier is using Roundup, there is a really heightened sensitivity to that. And so sourcing certified glyphosate-free is really important to consumers, and they are going to look for that. Soy milk also makes it on this side of the chart, despite some fake news that was present a few years ago about hormone imbalances linked to soy, predominantly because the protein content is comparable to dairy and there are organic options available. That said, growers outside North America are considered to be contributing to deforestation, so soy kind of has a mixed reaction. I dug a little deeper into why oat is gaining traction. We saw that significant growth in the US and Canada. And it is really about these points that you see here. Less carbon dioxide emissions, less water intensive, ranking high for nutritional value, allergy friendly, and importantly, from a consumer point of view, the taste is familiar and it's well liked. And so I expect we'll see oat milk as a base in different plant-based dairy alternatives continue to grow. Now from here, we start looking at launch data because when we examine new products hitting the shelf, we get a sense of what producers are supporting, and many times they're doing consumer research to back up those launches. So we do get some additional insights there. This shows plant-based launches over the last 5 years across 3 categories that Mintel tracks through their global new products database. They're plant-based beverages, frozen desserts, and yogurts. Now you see that everything was picking up momentum in 2019. Launches were up 27% collectively. Beverages consistently represent most of the activity here shown in brown, even through 2020. But frozen desserts and yogurt are gaining traction. So they moved from 35% of launches back in 2016 to almost 50% in the last year. So we examined each of these categories to learn more about the launch tactics. Now, because plant bases affect the overall taste experience for consumers, and because they do have those attitudes and concerns about different bases, we slice the launch data by base ingredient. So within beverages, you'll see that almond milk, shown here in yellow, dominates the category, at least through 2019. In 2020, well, really in 2019, oat milk emerged and then really took the lead in 2020. Producers are still relying on a variety of bases across the category. You see all kinds here, right? Soy, coconut, pea protein, cashew. Now, within the total of dairy-based beverage launches, plant-based represents a significant amount of innovation from an NPD perspective, at least half, if not over half in the last year. Remember though, that the market data showed us that plant-based dairy beverages only represent about 25% of North American retail. So the new products aren't really generating their fair share of sales yet. And we do expect some optimization to start occurring simply because you can't have this kind of assortment without producing results for retailers. Shifting to yogurt, market data shows that at just over 375 million in retail sales in North America last year in 2020, that means North America holds about 1/4 of the total global plant-based yogurt sales. Within North America, though, That share is pretty small. It's only about 7% of total yogurt sales in North America. And frankly, spoonable yogurt continues to battle consumer fatigue. So brands are trying to reignite consumer interest in the category and improve market growth by innovating around contemporary diet and lifestyle trends. That's where the plant-based comes in. And although these lines are in different charts, you can see the momentum here with plant-based starting to ratchet up, with dairy-based yogurts taking a bit of a decline. When we slice those launches again by bases, we see that unlike plant-based beverages, where NPD was focused on almond and now oat milk, spoonable yogurt producers have always favored coconut bases, at least for most of the last 5 years. That's the brown bar you see here. Almond launches surged in the last year. That's this yellow bar. Oat bases entered in 2019, and we did see more launches in 2020. You notice too that the range of bases used for spoonable yogurt isn't as diverse as beverages. As we saw with the line chart, plant-based yogurt new product development as a percent of total yogurt activity in North America is growing. So it represented more than 20% of new products last year. Again, though, the share of launches is much higher than the retail share, which was only 7%, suggesting that plant-based yogurt isn't getting its fair share. Now, turning to plant-based frozen desserts or ice creams, at 38% of global sales, North America's share of plant-based frozen desserts is highest among the 3 dairy alternative categories that we looked at. And it's shown the fastest growth over the last few years, 24% compounded annually. The category, though, falls in the middle of the pack in terms of market share, generates about 10% of total ice cream and frozen dessert sales in North America versus the 25% we saw for beverages and the 7% for yogurts. Still taking that perspective across the bases, though, we saw a really robust year of new product development in 2019, and then it dipped about 8% in 2020. Frozen dessert producers use a much wider range of bases than we see in the other categories. Like yogurt, though, frozen desserts go-to has been coconut. So you could see coconut existing across the 5-year span, followed by almond, which is shown here in yellow, although almond ebbs and flows and has really fallen off in the last year. Oat milk launches jumped in again in 2019 and really gained traction in 2020. And because these other bases pulled back, oat-based items actually accounted for 30% of new product activity in 2020 compared to 27% in 2019. The other dynamic that's interesting to note in frozen dessert is that blends have become increasingly popular, in part because manufacturers are striving to find the right combination of ingredients to deliver an ice cream-like experience while meeting budgetary constraints. As a percent of total category NPD, plant-based options are growing again, as we've seen in the other 2 categories, but the share still doesn't line up. So we see 14% of new products are contributing less than 10% of sales. At least the gap's a little closer than we saw in yogurt. Excuse me. So before we look at our survey findings, I have another quick poll for you, and that is, what plant-based ingredients are you exploring and or offering for your dairy alternatives? So you see the range here with the majors up top and then a couple little niche ones here. This is a multiple choice question, so you can choose as many as apply to you. So there we go. If you don't mind taking a moment to answer that. All right, oat and coconut are early front runners. Okay, I have soy coming in now and cashew, pea protein. All right, so let me go ahead and end polling. I'll share results so you can see, excuse me. Must be the grass cutting. All right, so here are the results. So you see that oat and coconut are clearly the front runners, but just as we saw in the launch data, you're all using a diverse set of bases. And so this is what consumers are exposed to and exploring too. So let me close that out. Let's turn to some of our survey results. One of the first questions we wanted to answer was who's buying plant-based dairy products? And so the demography is pretty closely aligned with the demographics of North America with a few differences. First, the audience skews a little bit more male than the average in North America. And we think this could be because of health concerns or perhaps interest in protein. The average age of people buying plant-based is 39, which tracks with North America. But these other socioeconomic characteristics, being married, employed, a college grad, and have children, all index significantly higher than the average population. We also asked what other plant-based dairy products people were buying besides frozen desserts, and there's quite a bit of cross-category usage. This is claimed purchase, remember. So 3/4 say they're buying plant-based milk, about 2/3 say they're buying plant-based yogurt, 60% say they're buying plant-based cheese or creamers, and a little over half are buying plant-based butter. I would view these numbers with a bit of skepticism simply because we know the market share is not that high. When we ask why they consider plant-based dairy, aligning with that earlier attitudinal research that we saw, they choose them because they're healthier or because they're better for the environment. You notice taste doesn't really rise to the top here. What surprised us a little bit about the demography was the diets they follow. We really thought we'd see many more vegetarians or flexitarians. Most of the respondents who say they're buying plant-based dairy say they're following a standard diet. And when it comes to concerns, we weren't surprised to see interest in no artificiality. That's a really broad trend. It did surprise us that we didn't have more people following specific diets, either gluten-free or lactose-free. So the net of this is the people who are buying plant-based dairy products are doing it by choice, not because they have to. We explored a little bit more deeply into regionality and ethnicity. And so I've broken it by census and province for the United States and Canada, and then looked across ethnic groups. In the US, most of the folks buying plant-based dairy are based on the coasts. And in Canada, almost half of our respondents were based in Ontario. In the United States, our respondents were predominantly white. We did have some people of color answering the survey. Although, and by the way, to answer the survey, they had to be a past purchase or have future interest in plant-based. And so this was under indexing what we see in the US population. We did have a much more diverse population in our Canadian respondents, as you can see here. So let's talk about the consumer experience. But before we get there, just a little bit of background on the survey. It was 15 minutes, 500 adults, US and Canada. As I mentioned, they had to be purchasers or have shopped for plant-based dairy options. And we asked them a bunch of questions. What have you tried? What are you interested in terms of plant-based frozen desserts? What drove your purchase? What was most important? Was it a flavor decision or a base decision? What are the characteristics that you value with plant-based frozen desserts, and how well do they deliver? That helps us understand the unmet needs of the category. And then because we're a flavor company, we wanted to understand the flavor themes that people were interested in, and we broke that by base because we really suspect that a flavor that you would pair with a soy might be different than when you pair with coconut, for example. So here's the incidence of consumers that are open to plant-based frozen desserts. And this could be analogous to household penetration, although it's probably a little bit higher because we did ask about future purchase interest. So importantly, we had to talk to about 1,200 people to find our 500, which gives us an incidence of about 37% in the US and 17% in Canada of people who are open to the idea. Consistently across both countries, though, was a diminishing interest by age group. So your key target, if you're developing a strategy, is really in this 21 to 35 with a little bit of 36 to 50. Once you get into the 51 plus, your interest is pretty low. And we'll explore reasons why that is. In terms of usage of frozen desserts, it's not surprising that at the top of the list, most people are engaged with traditional dairy. And then the next bases on the leaderboard really reflect what we saw in the milk space in North America, with almond milk up at the top, followed by coconut, oat, and soy, and then some of these niche bases making up the remainder. We were surprised too to find that the average number of bases that respondents purchased was over 5, meaning that they're willing to explore. And again, we'll examine why that is in a moment. We next ask, how likely would you be to buy this base in the future? And for the most part, the ranking mirrored what we saw in terms of, past purchase intent. So up at the top, you have traditional dairy. People are staying in that category. And then the rest follow the same ranking. We did have a little bit more interest in rice milk than expected. But what this allows us to do then is take a look at the difference between what have you purchased and what you're interested in to get a measure of unrealized potential. Now, not surprisingly, there's not much upside for traditional dairy. We do see some gaps, though, in terms of coconut, oat, almond, and soy. The gaps get a little wider when you get into some of these niche bases in terms of potential, but keep in mind the purchase interest in these is low to begin with. So this is probably an uphill battle. We asked why people buy both plant-based and traditional, and about 7 out of 10 do buy both. And the reasons varied. Some like the taste of both equally. Some view plant-based as something new. They're flavor adventurers and wanted to try it. Some were driven by flavor. They found a flavor in plant-based that they couldn't find in traditional, so that got it into the cart. Another 4 in 10 say, plant-based represents something healthier. Traditional is a little bit more indulgent. Others say there's different needs in my family and they serve different purposes. So there is a reason for both in the category. There's a reason for being. In terms of exploring the other decision criteria, we did ask what drives you to purchase. Is it the flavor of plant-based, of frozen desserts, or the base? And in frozen desserts, flavor is the driver for 2/3 of our respondents. For this other third, we're like, the traditional base in dairy is unchanged. So what's really driving this number? And it is among people buying plant-based frozen desserts who look at that base. So yes, flavor is still important, but for many of those folks, they are reading the back or reading the front of pack to find out the base that's included. But when push comes to shove, we said, all right, if you force a choice, what's most important, base or flavor? And you see that 60% of our respondents said flavor is at least, if not more important than the base. So yes, it comes into the decision-making process, but ultimately it's the flavor that makes them pick one brand or one item over another. That takes us to this idea of brand and the importance of brand when purchasing. When frozen desserts, yes, it has to be a brand I trust. 3/4 of consumers say it's very or somewhat important, and 2/3 say it has to be a brand that I know. When we look at this through the lens of plant-based frozen desserts, excuse me, the perspective changes a little bit. So we still have 60% of people who say it has to be a brand I trust in the frozen dessert category. But we have 4 in 10 who say, if they make a plant-based product and they enter into frozen desserts, I'd give them a try. Still an element of trust. It's just coming from a different direction. So if you're already in the frozen dessert space and you have a trusted brand, it's okay to extend into plant-based. And similarly, if you're in plant-based and want to enter into this category, there's room for you as well. So the role of flavor. When we asked how important is, flavor to your decision, 55% of our consumers said, I'll try anything that looks good. In frozen dessert, right, ice cream is always good. We had a smaller group, about little less than 1/3, who said, as long as it's a variation of something I like vanilla or chocolate, I'll give it a try. And then even a more narrow niche that said, I'm going to stick with vanilla and chocolate. I might try some variations, but I'm going to be pretty loyal to the flavor profiles I prefer. When it came to inclusions, in the US, if you add any goodie into the ice cream, the US consumers are in. Whether it's a variegate, a chunk of chocolate, a bit of fruit or cookie or nuts, it's all good. The Canadian consumers in our survey, it's not that they don't like inclusions, it's just that, remember, the context here is how important are the inclusions to your purchase decision. For Canadians, this is not a big deciding factor. For 4 in 10 it is, but 60% would be just fine with something that doesn't have all the extras. So what are the other desirable characteristics of frozen desserts? We asked a bunch of questions of our consumers, all of them shown here. And we did a factor analysis to understand the themes that were underlying these different characteristics. So we had several characteristics that fall into this idea of health. Others fell into dietary considerations. We know that the sensory experience with frozen desserts is pretty critical. We've already talked about brand trust. And then at a high level, we also asked about flavor expectations. So with that in mind, we said, okay, here are our themes. We still want to look at each individual characteristic to see how they rank in terms of importance. And here they are. they're color coded to match the themes. So in the top 10, at the very top is having a brand that they trust. And then flavor, lining up with our push comes to shove chart where we said flavor is important to 60% of consumers. You see flavor in red emerging several times in the top 10 characteristics. Similarly, sensory experience is very important. It has to be creamy, and for plant-based, has to have a texture like dairy-based ice cream. Now, naturalness does come in, or health perceptions come in terms of natural ingredients and giving them a healthier option. In the top 20, we start to see a desire for a functional benefit, high protein, low, no sugar. But when it comes to dietary considerations, and remember we saw in our demography that people really aren't choosing this because of a diet, they're choosing it because they want to have a healthier option or improve the environment. So you see a lot of these dietary considerations falling into the bottom third. That doesn't mean they're not important or there isn't a play here. I mean, you have between 40 and 50% of people looking for these very specialized solutions. It's just not going to be a mainstream product for most consumers. So that's what's important to consumers in choosing a frozen dessert. Before we talk about how well plant-based solutions deliver, if you don't mind taking our last poll, tell me some of your challenges with plant-bases. Does it deal with flavor delivery, mouthfeel, sweetness, stability? Are you struggling with plant-based choices versus the cost constraints? Maybe something else, or maybe you have no challenges and you're all set. This is a multiple choice answer too, if you don't mind taking a minute and answering this. And I'll do this last one. And there we go, if you don't mind answering that. Lots of challenges. All right. So let me end the polling. Thank you, and sharing the results. So you can see there are myriad challenges with plant-based frozen desserts. Texture and mouthfeel is a top priority or top challenge, followed by flavor delivery, stability and performance. We see sweetness, making the right choice about the plant base. And then we do have a couple of people that don't have any challenges, that they're doing quite well. So thank you for taking time to answer that. So let's take a look and see what consumers think and see if they recognize the challenges that you face. These charts take a look at how well different bases perform against what's important, those characteristics that we looked at. And these charts reflect the deviation from expected value. In a nutshell, the closer the base is to the attribute, the more likely it is to be delivering well on the characteristic. So I know there's a lot going on here. I'll walk you through some of the key findings. With almond milk, for example, and recognize that's the #1 base in America, and it's pretty popular. So for consumers, they said, yep, almond milk is a brand I trust in frozen desserts. It's a familiar brand. And you know what? I see that it comes in fun flavors. Other brands in frozen desserts that are familiar are those made of soy milk and coconut milk, again, reflecting the predominance on the shelf. In terms of strong flavor, now at some point consumers, if they don't have experience, they're going on their perceptions. So they say, you know, avocado I think would have a strong flavor. In terms of new and different flavors, they say maybe pea protein or rice milk could offer something like that. From a sensory perspective, almond milk again scores highest out of all the bases in terms of delivering a creamy experience, although soy gets rated to having a texture like dairy. So there's a bit of discrepancy here between what consumers think of texture like dairy and creaminess. We'll explore that a little bit further in a minute. In terms of flavors, coconut milk does well with traditional flavors, sweet flavors, indulgent flavors. So coconut's a very good carrier flavor currently. In terms of other things that stand out, avocado is deemed to have a thick texture in a plant-based solution. Again, this could be based more on perception than experience. And when it comes to offering savory plant-based frozen desserts, people say, if you're going to do that, do a spinach or pea protein. The other ones cluster fairly closely, meaning that consumers aren't discriminating very much in terms of how well they deliver. Health perceptions also cluster fairly closely, with a couple exceptions. So coconut milk, is it coconut milk? No, I beg your pardon, spinach is deemed to have a functional benefit and to deliver low, no sugar. Here's avocado with natural ingredients. Am I doing that right? Yes. And then the others really are fairly clustered. We've got pea protein delivering low calorie. So, if you are going to talk about the health perceptions of your plant-based frozen dessert, you need to be very clear about front of pack, because we know what's important to consumers. Remember that hierarchy? Some of the health perceptions were at least in the top 20. And right now, nothing is really standing out. So it could be a point of difference for you if you want to talk about how you're healthier in some way, or if you want to add a functional benefit. There is an opportunity because there's a gap in terms of what's available currently. Dietary considerations too, we see a lot of clustering together. Interestingly, almond milk falls short on all dietary considerations. That's this line shown in green. Avocado is shown as being most keto friendly. Spinach is associated with being vegan. Hemp milk is associated with being gluten-free. Surprisingly, oat milk is second, but still a fairly long distance away. So again, opportunity here, if you do want to make a play for a niche positioning, delivering a dietary benefit, it is something to really call out on pack and in your communication so that consumers see that messaging and they can understand that that's a solution for them. So with that as a background, we understand what's important. We know how plant-based is delivered. We put together this nice matrix that identifies holistically what are the strengths of plant-based frozen desserts and where are the opportunities. They're also color-coded to align with those themes we talked about earlier. So strengths of plant-based, natural ingredients, healthier option. Some of them offer a functional benefit. They come from familiar brands I trust, they're easy to serve, and to some extent they're sweet and creamy, although these are at the lower end of strengths. The opportunities really center in flavor and mouthfeel, the two dimensions that you identified as some of your challenges. There are some niche needs that plant-based could fulfill. We talked about those earlier. So having a low calorie, low sugar, low carb alternative. And then these niche opportunities where they're not necessarily important, but plant-based are doing okay right now, or could do okay. A gluten-free, organic, a low-fat, high protein. So this is a nice perspective to use almost as a roadmap of helping us understand where the opportunity gaps are within frozen desserts. Knowing that everything really revolved around flavor and mouthfeel, we wanted to explore flavor more specifically. So we asked consumers to describe flavor families. We gave them this list of families, and we gave specific examples of each so they could understand the difference between a berry and a citrus and a melon, for example. And then we asked them to link each of these flavor families with specific need states. So tell us which flavors are good for adults versus kids, which are healthier, which are comforting, exciting, nostalgic, indulgent. We had a boatload of data from this part of the survey, and so we've put it into a perceptual map. Now, perceptual maps depict what's most distinctive, and the interpretation of the map is based on spatial relationships. So the closer a flavor family shown in blue is to a specific characteristic, the more people associate it with that characteristic. So if you want to, for example, come up with an exciting and new flavor profile, consumers expect that to be a spice or botanical. If you want something that's good for kids, in contrast, you would look at a berry, maybe a fruit, or maybe a fun flavor. That's a little further away. Consumers look to simple, sweet flavors for familiarity, nostalgia, and comfort. Interestingly, indulgent flavors are also associated with comfort, but we know, particularly in this last year, that a sweet treat was a way to get comfort in some difficult times. The other thing to look at when you're looking at a perceptual map is the distance between the characteristics. So in this case, melon, citrus, tropical fruit, and berry are somewhat substitutable, although each have unique points of difference. Consumers tend to view them similarly, and they view all of them to have a slightly healthier profile. And so then, with all of this as backdrop, we said, let's put it all together And let's talk about the opportunities for plant-based frozen desserts. We'll look at it by base because we know that's important to consumers. Start with almond milk. It's the #1 base in North America. There is a bit of a gap in terms of upside. Almond milk is a fairly versatile platform that could carry a lot of different flavor profiles. In terms of positives, right now almond milk comes from trusted brands in the frozen dessert space. It's viewed to be dairy-like, sweet with fun flavors. Cautions associated with almond milk, though, are that sustainability that we talked about early on. They are viewed to be not aligned with dietary needs either. If you remember our spider graph, almond milk was right in the dead center. It doesn't have strong dietary links. And right now the base is declining in Canada. So up next is soy milk. It's the #2 base in North America, also has an opportunity gap. It's a little bit less versatile in terms of the flavors that consumers can pair with soy. But it does, there are familiar brands in the marketplace that are vegan, organic, those are pluses. And it does carry, some indulgent and savory flavor opportunities. And even though it's fake news, consumers still have some allergen perceptions associated with soy. It's also viewed to be not as creamy, lower protein, and the base is declining across North America. Coconut milk is third up in North America in terms of sales. It's a little bit more versatile even than almond milk in terms of being able to carry a lot of different flavor profiles. It too has familiar brands and a dairy-like experience, but because of the less sustainability and being high in sugar and lower in protein, it does have some fairly strong negatives associated with it currently. And then last is oat milk on our top 4. Probably has the widest gap of these top sellers. Consumers don't link a lot of flavors with it, unfortunately. So an oat milk launch would be a little bit more simpler in structure, at least as consumers make that association. It too comes from a trusted brand. Now, it has a creamy, thick texture, but not necessarily a dairy texture, at least in consumers' minds. So they're associating it more with oatmeal than they are oat milk. That said, the fact that it's healthier, gluten-free, organic, sustainable, those are all pluses if you're considering an oat milk base for your frozen dessert. It is weaker on some functional benefits, but those pluses far outweigh some of these cautions. I'm going to build out the remaining bases because with the exception of avocado, which is viewed to be a pretty versatile platform, the other bases, people just don't know what to do in terms of, gosh, what flavors would pair with those? There are those larger gaps that we talked about, but you still have a fairly low purchase intent overall. And while these do have some positive associations, the big watch out with working with any of these alternative bases is really around flavor and texture. And knowing that that's already a concern, and many of you aren't in these bases, these come with a lot of watch outs. Now you could potentially, and we've seen this in the marketplace, right, where you combine pea protein with something else, so you get the benefit of protein plus perhaps the creaminess of another base. I think that's a reasonable path to take as you're starting, but to do a sole pea protein alternative is probably not going to do very well in market. So let me see how I'm doing on time. Oh, pretty good. That wraps up what I have for us today. Are there any questions that I can take? Let me see here. I'll go over here. I do. It said, you mentioned that blends are emerging in plant-based frozen desserts. What are the components of the blends? That's a really good question. So when I look at the launch data, I'm seeing a range of some proprietary protein blends. I've seen sunflower milk combined with coconut cream, coconut oil with peanut butter, and coconut milk combined with cashew milk. So there's not quite like the Wild West, but there's a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity right now in the marketplace. So if you'd like to see the full range of those blend options, just email me here and I'll send you that list. Let's see what else. Oh, okay. One of our participants uses a base that's made from buckwheat. So that's not a base that's currently available in North America. But given the range that we saw in frozen desserts, it wouldn't surprise me that that would enter in at some point. It says most of the plant-based frozen desserts I've seen are launched in pints. What's the status of novelties? Another good question, thank you. So when I looked at the launch data in North America in the last 6 months, there were more than 50 items hitting retail shelves. About 13% were novelties, either bars or pops, which to me is going after that convenience market, but there's also a play for trying to attract more younger audiences or even children, because we know that eating anything on a stick is pretty fun. Okay. Is there really a spinach-based frozen dessert? Yes. Yes, there is. What I saw was that it's usually a limited time offer. It's usually sold online or in food service. We haven't seen many in retail, but you can find them. And if you Google spinach-based frozen dessert, there are millions of recipes online, which suggests that consumers are curious. So maybe not the base that you would launch with necessarily, but certainly an opportunity to add it to your portfolio, particularly if you do it as a blend. I think there is something there. And then I do have one more question. Are there deeper insights into the study that you've done? Yes. So we do have an ebook that's coming out, we hope next week. And so what I'll do, in addition to sending you a link to the webinar, I'll send you a copy of the ebook so that you have a copy of these insights. And if you're going through either the reviewing the webinar or the ebook itself, please reach out to me directly with any questions, and I'll share what I can and answer your questions. And if you have questions about the formulation challenges that we identified, let me know that too, and I will connect you with one of our flavorists or application scientists. So coming up, our next webinar is going to feature consumer insights about functionality in foods and beverages. We just wrapped up a study that explores the benefits that consumers want beyond basic nutrition and the categories where they'd like to find those benefits. And as I said, we're a flavor company, so we took it a step further and we said, all right, you say you want this function, you want it in this category, what kind of flavors would you associate with that functionality? So stay tuned. In the next few months, I'll be sharing those results. Let me stop sharing this. So as we close, when we close, as you sign out, if you don't mind, take a few minutes and share your feedback about the webinar today, besides my voice and the lawn mowing. Let me know how we did, if there's something else that you'd like to see, because it really does help us frame content that's going to help you longer term. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you all have a great afternoon.